Lucky enough to survive the onslaught of the plague, then great opportunities unfolded for you.
What kind of opportunities?
Well, there was plenty of land available. Land had been short before the Black Death. In the wake of the Black Death, there's a superabundance of it. And also, wages begin to rise really quite dramatically.
So you could be much more mobile?
You could be more mobile, and also you could hope to earn a great deal more. And the consumer power of the peasantry is growing in this period.
So how did the employers cope with this shortage of labour?
Well, they try to buck the market, essentially. The government, acting on their behalf, introduces legislation to restrict the movement of labour and also restrict wage levels. And this obviously produces considerable tension and discontent.
And then this huge tax gets dumped on people?
Yes, a series of pressures are building within the peasant community, within the peasant economy. You've got restrictive legislation coming from the centre, and on top of this you've also got a novel form of tax, the like of which has never been seen before.
King Richard II was only 14 when the revolt started. People didn't blame him for the oppression and chaos. They believed the king was divinely appointed and trusted him implicitly. The only problem was that he was young.
You couldn't expect a little kid to rule on his own, so when things started to go from bad to worse, people began to blame his advisors, who seemed to be doing pretty nicely out of all the disasters.
The most hated figure was John of Gaunt, the king's uncle. He helped institute the poll tax. People suspected him of siphoning off funds for his own use. And joining Gaunt on the peasants' most hated list were two churchmen, Archbishop of Canterbury Simon Sudbury, who was Chancellor of England, and the Treasurer Robert Hales. Together, they were responsible for organising the Get Tough collection of the poll tax.
Cup of tea, please, mate.
Cheers. No more takeaway.
Takeaway, please.
Cheers, thank you. Take sugar.
No.
Thank you.
It wasn't unusual in the Middle Ages for churchmen to hold down top political and economic jobs, and it wasn't unusual for them to carry on their duties in a pretty unchristian way. But Sudbury and Hales made loan sharks today seem like the Salvation Army. The fact that the commissioners were so extraordinarily heavy-handed was completely down to them. Little bacon roll as well?
Yeah, no problem.
What amazes me is why people didn't snap sooner. They've had the plague, they've had landlords trying to force down their wages, they've had to pay for wars in France with an unfair tax, which always seems to end up in the nobility's pockets. But commissioners sexually assaulting their women, that pushed them over the edge. The peasants' revolt had started when Thomas the Baker's men had kicked out the tax commissioners from Brentwood. The backlash came almost immediately.
The next day, another tax officer turned up in Brentwood with a small troop of soldiers to calm the crowd and quell the riot. But they'd completely underestimated the strength of popular feeling. It was dangerous to rebel against a king's representative, but these were people who'd passed the point of no return. They didn't care that they were committing treason. For the first time, the rebellion turned violent.
6 of the king's men were beheaded, the rest fled. The rebels had crossed a line. There was no going back. The English nobility saw the people who worked for them as little more than savages, but within a few days, these people would organise a revolt with a specific agenda and carry it out with ruthless efficiency. Thomas the Baker from Fobbing had lit the torch of freedom. Within a matter of days, it would engulf the land in fire. When an angry crowd beheaded the king's tax collectors at Brentwood, they kicked off other outbreaks of violence and unrest. Rioting swiftly spread across Essex and beyond. 4 days later, anger at the poll tax exploded in Kent.
This is Thamesmead on the south side of the Thames. At first glance, you wouldn't imagine that it's crawling with history. But it was here that the peasants' revolt stopped being just a bunch of riots over a long hot summer and started to become something much more like a military campaign.
Just down the road is the rebels' first major target, Lesnes Abbey.
Now, you may think it's a pretty soft target and a million miles away from the poll tax, but in fact, abbeys like this one owned the vast majority of the land in England, and the abbots who ran them were like the managing directors of financial institutions. Not only that, but they were employers, so all the tax records would have been in there.
These tax rebels were led by a man called Abel Kerr from Erith, a nearby port on the Thames. Abel brought his men here and surrounded the abbey. Faced with an angry mob of peasants and fearing for the monastery and his life, the abbot surrendered. With limited resources, Abel had secured his first victory.
Then he went across the river into Essex and tried to mobilise men there, picked up 100 men in Barking, brought them back to here and continued the mayhem. But Mike, when I was a kid on the borders of London and Essex, we never went south of the river. I think the first time I ever went was when I went on holiday to Folkestone when I was about 12. Wouldn't it have been the same then?
No, quite the opposite. In the 14th century, there was a tremendous estuary culture. The Thames here was full of boats plying to and fro between Essex and Kent. The only land crossing was London Bridge down the river there. But here, tremendous agricultural region in Kent, tremendous agricultural region in Essex, produce, livestock, people, trade, hundreds of boats to and fro.
But Mike, Abel went to Barking and back here in a flash.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of the logistics of this rebellion and a lot of issues to do with medieval travel that we need to explore and experiment with. Undoubtedly, he must have used horses.
See, one of the things about the Chronicles is that they're great at telling us what happened, but absolutely useless in telling us how it happened. So we've brought Mike in as Mr. How It Happened, and your first challenge is to work out how Abel and his horsemen would have crossed the river. Do you think you can do that?
Certainly, I will don the mantle of the rebels and represent their journey through this uprising.
So while Mike starts the business of retracing one part of the revolt with Abel Kerr, I'm heading back north of the river. Because what made the revolt so confusing for the authorities was that it was springing up all over the place before they had time to react. Essex was the birthplace of the revolt, and events there were moving at breakneck speed.
At exactly the same time as Abel Kerr and his men were surrounding Lesnes Abbey in Kent, the ringleaders and founders of the rebellion were launching their manifesto here at Bocking in Essex.
The chronicles of the time dismissed the peasants as disorganised rabble. But the summit held here on the 2nd of June 1381 provides a vital clue to the true nature of the revolt.
They weren't just a bunch of troublemakers. The agenda was put together by leading, respected members of their communities who thought they were being really patriotic by defending traditional rights. On the 2nd of June, they declared their intention to destroy divers lieges of the king, which means to get rid of Sudbury and Gaunt and those they thought were corrupting the king, and to have no laws in England, only those that they themselves moved to be ordained. This was dynamite, the assertion that people could actually rule themselves. And they made sure that everyone was going to hear that message. They sent messages out into the surrounding villages. These people were well organised, weren't they?
They were organised, certainly around areas like Colchester, which was the heart of the Great Society. And we think in villages all around the southeast of England there would have been a nucleus of radicals who've been organising for some time.
So do you reckon that there were radical cells dotted all over the country which all kind of keyed in to this feeling of revolt?
Certainly in the southeast and the counties around London,